4, 3, 2, 1. And this is episode 18 of the Art of Move podcast. I am Anthony Manuel. I'm here with my good friend, Dr. William Raybar. We're out here in the Canadian Rockies trying to find that grand unified theory of human movement and the truth and how we should train, live, and just exist in our bodies. I'm back from a week in Mexico, so we missed last week, but we're back going strong. Probably get another 1 or 2 episodes this week. And we're actually past 500 listens podcast-wide between Spotify, iTunes, and all the popular podcast streaming platforms. So for everyone who is listening to our podcast on a regular basis, thank you from the bottom of my heart. It boggles my mind that there are people who just want to come and listen to us talk for a while, and we certainly have fun doing it. On our last episode, we talked quite a bit about popular functional training movement systems, things like GOTA, WEC method, functional patterns. We kind of dove into FRC a little bit. And, one of the things that I kind of noticed about a lot of these functional training systems is rather than focusing on pure muscular force or force output or strength, as it's maybe conventionally looked at in a strength and conditioning context, is they actually have an emphasis on fascial integrity and utilizing stored elastic strength in the elastic tissues of the body versus just focusing on pure force output of the muscles, which usually, when you think about the systems of the body and training, most people think of the muscular system, right? We've talked about this a lot in other training systems. The default state is to try and get jacked in going to the gym and training and using your body. People who think about elasticity and flexibility and the ability to have this elastic recoil are usually people like sprinters or dancers or people who are more involved in body weight movement practices that require a lot of elasticity, a lot of bounce, and a lot of movement coordination. But usually our physical culture is so disoriented around that movement coordination and that elastic energy storage and release. And I kind of wanted to talk about that. We can dive a little bit into the difference between muscles and fascia and how you can sort of blend your training to kind of emphasize not just muscular development and pure force output, not just emphasizing strength at the expense of good movement or the expense of, elastic fascial tissue, which can actually provide more energy with less energy output. That was sort of where my head was at for today's episode. We are freestyling a little bit, but I kind of wanted to start there. For you, I know you kind of got me into boxing, and boxing was the first thing where it was like you kind of tried to get me to relax a lot more so that I could kind of use that elastic recoil in my fascial tissue as opposed to just trying to power my way through and punch everything, because that would gas me out. You want to talk a little bit about preliminary thoughts, when you're thinking of training for that energy storage and release of the fascial tissues versus just pure muscular output? What comes to mind for you?
Well, you just mentioned it there, right? Storage of elastic energy is key. That's nowhere to be found right now. Even in the conversations people are having, it's force output. But what is really causing the force output? If you're in the middle of the range of your motion and just starting the motion, likely it's muscle pulling you or pushing you, right? So basically, if I'm in the middle range, let's say I'm using my shoulder, and let's say I'm halfway up a bench press or a push-up, I'm likely to be using the muscular force to push me, contractions within the muscles. However, if I'm whipping fast like a boxing punch, I'm using the elastic tension from my fascia to whip most of the energy. And I'm using just a little bit of muscular force to control where my bones go. Okay, so that's the difference. It's really a view into how we look at force production. Most people think it's muscles, but it's actually a combination of the two. And the faster you go and the more coordinated you are, the more the complex motions come into play, the more you're going to be using elastic tensions and compressions versus muscle.
It's funny. I just want to make a point of how pervasive this thought is that, muscular output is one of the most important or the most important factor in athletic performance. There was this tweet that I saw, pretty obvious gym bro kind of talking about a client or someone he knew. He's like, well, I'm already running 6 times a week. do I even need to lift? And it's like, of course you need to lift. If you have stronger legs, then you're going to run, your run times are going to be better, and you're going to have more muscle mass, and more muscle mass is healthy and good for you. And I don't know a single situation where more muscle mass, like actual added weight, well, maybe a little bit, if you're totally emaciated, that might help. But, is more muscle mass going to help you run a marathon or an ultra marathon? I would contest that no.
At some point, having huge muscles is a detriment. We all know this to athletic movement. Otherwise, bodybuilders and powerlifters would be the most athletic people out there. And that's just not the case. The question is how much muscle to put on that still benefits athletic motions and real life motions without detriment to the movement itself or the joints. I propose that it's not that much at all. Like, we don't need much actual size of muscle. We need to understand how to connect the elastic forces better. So for instance, if I'm running and my leg comes up like flexing my hip, bringing my knee up, but I'm in fast motion, it's not going to be the muscle contracting that's going to bring that leg back. It's going to be the elastic force increasing. And then at a certain point, my body knows to release that storage of energy. An even better example is, let's say a kangaroo doesn't have huge muscles, but it does have a long Achilles tendon, and that stores elastic recoil. And that's how fascia really works, right? So if you work your fascia, if you treat it more like that, where it's bounding and it's bouncy, it's going to give you a lot more elastic energy back. But if you compress it like you do in the gym, okay, a lot of exercises are very compressive, then your fascia is going to start behaving in that manner, okay? And you won't have that elastic recoil and energy as a free byproduct of your motions, okay? And you're going to start to get bound up. This is generalizing, though. The real question is how much actual lifting and how much power training or training traditionally to get the muscles bigger is beneficial to actual motions. Again, I propose not that much.
What situation could you imagine that adding musculature would be beneficial to motion?
When you're in a sport where weight matters. So right. Let's say a football player or lineman actually having to go up against a 300-pound person and push them. Okay, at that point, muscular force and weight just may be a factor, right? A lot of the throwing sports, let's say shot put, where again, if you're bigger, you can throw it further just because of your mass. Let's say this is an interesting scenario though. Let's say you're a fighter, okay? And you train to be like Bruce Lee. You can spin around, you can move up and down, you have really good elastic recoil of your fascia. But then you just have a huge 300-pound guy that's muscle bound, like a power lifter. He may be able to beat up Bruce Lee. So in that sport scenario, maybe having more mass actually helps, right? At some point, being bigger helps a lot of things. But if you want to age well, if health is your goal, if athleticism is your goal and to move better, then we have to start thinking more fascia, more elasticity, more bounding, more connections of body parts versus just pumping muscles up and getting them stronger.
So this is interesting because there's a few situations, obviously, that you just mentioned where muscle is relevant. I think socially, maybe, like if you're thinking in terms of social hierarchy, muscle is sort of seen as a symbol of high testosterone in men and of health. Like usually when we looked at those bodybuilding magazines back in the day, we just assumed these bodybuilders were the healthiest people, even though they probably weren't. Like a lot of these steroid using extremists wrecking their bodies with chronic training and inflammation bodybuilders with caffeine dependencies on their pre-workouts, those are not healthy people, but they look like paragons of health because of the aesthetic sort of maybe cultural preconditioning that we have, right? So there's a social benefit to having not a ton of muscle mass. There's a point of diminishing returns on that, right? Like in terms of a bodybuilder versus like a Calvin Klein model, who's going to have more social proof in that situation? Well, unless you're in a bodybuilding circle, it's probably, the Brad Pitt looking guy from Fight Club is going to have a little bit more social benefit in that situation, right? But muscle mass as a goal in and of itself, that's mostly a socially preconditioned thing. I think there are, like you said, in a fight scenario, you could have like a 140-pound dude who's fast as fuck and can spin himself around, but if he's going up against like a 300-pound lineman, it's going to be like flea bites, right? So you kind of have to pick your battles here. There is a time and a place to build more muscle, but again, we always kind of say, whenever we're talking about anything, we're coming from the frame of the goal that we're looking for is to have a healthy body for life, and not just a healthy body for life, but like a well-functioning, well-moving body for life. Like when you're watching those videos of those 101-year-olds running, running races, and they're doing those funny little steps. We want to move better than those people even, like we're talking like extreme longevity of the human body and its tissues. So that's the frame that we're coming in. When you're thinking about bounding and elastic recoil and training fascia in this way, is there a way to modify conventional training or lifting, do you think? It's funny because we're talking to Keegan Smith of the ATG system, and one of the things that I kind of learned from him or started experimenting with him has been some end range bouncing training, like a lot of repetitions in these end range positions that kind of have this bouncy quality to them. And that sort of end range training with that bouncing rep style makes you feel really elastic. It makes you feel first of all that you have that freedom in that range. It's almost like signaling to your nervous system that you can access that range and have that bounce in it. But then, it also is conditioning that bounce in that end range. What do you think of that?
I agree with training bounding to bound better. The only difference is for me, I would rather do it in a more functional position. So I don't think the bench press carries over to a punch very well. That's just my personal opinion. Now, the counter argument is obviously going to be like, well, we create the tissue with the bench press because we can load it more, and then you can move it into your sport. That's where I just fundamentally disagree, and I don't think we're going to find a paper here that's going to prove either way, right? So my way to do it would be to train elasticity in an open chain if that's what your goal is going to be, a throwing or punching motion, right? So that's just my opinion on that. I'm on the same camp as the ATG guys where I want to train tissue very specifically. I just do it slightly different, right? So instead of doing, like the range of strength, Lucas Aaron, how he does a lot of splits and things like that, to me, I have to quickly move that into an actual motion. Because I've noticed that I'm not that flexible, but I'm very loose as I move. Do you know what I mean? So like where are the people that are super flexible that can move, that train flexibility, like in a weights context, but can move really well and prove it? Do you know what I mean? That don't come from originally like a capoeira background.
Yeah, I would say, well, I was going to say, it's like you probably have martial artists, ballerinas, maybe like people who are adherents of the movement culture, for example. Ido Portal method practitioners are very, very big on loaded mobility, and they do sets and reps. Like Ido Portal is very, very influenced by Charles Poliquin in terms of how he sets up his sets and reps. I had the privilege of working with a guy named Julian Shavers. He's a movement practitioner, I think a physiotherapist too, out of Winnipeg. And he worked with Andrea Ospina. He took the Kinstretch certifications, the FRC certifications, and he was actually, Ido Portal used to have a certification for coaches, and he actually took that certification program with Ido Portal. And I had the opportunity of working with him when we both still lived in Halifax. And we talked a lot about how, Ido kind of programs in a conventional way to sort of follow this principle of isolate, integrate, and improvise, right? So within movements, he would define patterns, and we've defined a lot of different patterns. We've defined locomotive patterns principally because the patterns that we're prioritizing are locomotion patterns, walking and running specifically in a forward way, not backwards necessarily. So forward locomotive pattern, but in the Ito Portal method, you would define a pattern that you're looking at, and you would look at your whole chain, and you would see where's the weak point in your chain, and you would start training that in an isolated way, right? So you would develop the tissues, and you would still do loaded mobility if you're trying to do like one of these capoeira movements, but you didn't have the range in your hamstrings, right? And you can't kick up high enough. You would probably do loaded mobility and loaded flexibility work to get this range, while then also practicing, the preliminary parts of the movement, breaking it down so that you could chain these together. If you don't have the requisite mobility or strength for movements in general, for the patterns in general, then that's when isolation, that's when, tissue training comes into play. I think the thing that I hear you talking about the most is that, like, okay, but there are certain sets of patterns that we should prioritize, which are, functional and relevant to our biology. And by our biology, I mean like the actual design or the actual native structure of the human body, what it was designed to do. So stand, walk, run, throw.
I think we really should just, in general, in the public discussion, separate what athletes do and what you should be able to do ideally as you age, right? Because a lot of athletes want to get into these positions that are crazy, like the splits. You could go your whole life without doing the splits and be very athletic. You know what I mean? But a martial artist may want to do the splits, and because he needs it for martial arts or just wants to do it for gymnastics or in general, right? It really is goal dependent. So if you need to get into ranges of motion that are extreme, doing the isolated range of motion flexibility type exercises is the way to go. That is what to do. So something like what Lucas Aaron's doing with range of strength, or the Flexi Bowl, or FRC even does this, but they do it more through a joint capsule end of it. Then you have to isolate. But I don't think you need extreme ranges of motion to do basic walking, running, cutting, really athletic motions in real life, right? So I don't think you need extreme ranges of motion. So if you do have the prerequisite ranges of motion, we quickly move on to how to work the body parts together in an elastic way, in unison, in a dance, in synchronicity. That's very important to me. However, the base is always the same for me now. It's more the go-to base. It's the back chain dominant. It's the inside ankle bone high. It's the get into a bow, 22.5 in, 22.5 out, 45-degree angle with your knee as you move through space. Internal to external with both the tibia and the femur. Same time, right? The hip goes around a corner. These, and using the spinal engine, head over foot or in your columns. Okay, I just named all the things that I kind of look for when I run. None of those have to do with extreme ranges of motion. So for me, that's out of the window. But let's say I want to get my kick higher for martial arts. I'm definitely going to dip into that. So, I mean, we just have to separate athleticism and normal movements for healthy aging.
So let's talk about those normal movements, because I think, one of the things for me too, I think there are mobility prerequisites, or there are range prerequisites to doing that. For example, if you sit on your ass all the time and you have really bound up hip flexors and you've been front chain dominant and a lot of that is bound up, then when you start to go into these movements, you can dump into the wrong places and your bows can actually set in the wrong way. And I actually, in my opinion, this has been my experience when I was exploring it, I actually had to do a lot of different range work just to open my hips, for example, to set a proper bow. Because I started getting back and knee pain doing bows and corners improperly just because I was setting wrong, because I had bound up hips and I didn't have the range. I had an overly compressed core from doing so much core bracing work that I didn't have the mobility in through my spine. So I was starting to dump into other places, right? So there's relevance in terms of, when I think of range training, or, what Lucas Aaron does with his range of strength stuff, which, when I did it, I mentioned in previous podcasts, when I did range of strength training, I felt the best in my body I think that I've ever felt, in terms of just like how free and loose and well moving my body was in comparison to the chronically compressed state that I was in from lifting and doing strength and conditioning training all the time, right? I was allowing more room in, like you said, when you start to train in that chronically compressed way with weightlifting, then that's how your fascia starts to behave, right? So when I was doing some of these dynamic kicks and the stretches and I was basically decompressing my pre-compressed system. I think that is you need to understand that there's a baseline too for doing a lot of these fundamental patterns. And I think there's an applicable, like so this is a recent experience I've had doing a lot of go to work, specifically training inside ankle bone high and keeping my heels elevated. I lost a lot of my resting squat posture, a lot of the mobility through my hips and hamstrings that I sort of worked on. It's funny because I could still do all my folding mobility was great, but my squat mobility and my dorsiflexion kind of went out the window because I've been basically prioritizing this high heel position, trying to condition that outer calf and trying to keep that inside ankle bone high and focusing on bows and corners. And like, again, I had great mobility through those movements because I'd probably done, thousands of repetitions of them. But then trying to go into just a rest, like I can't do a body weight squat. I tried to do a body weight squat the other day the way I used to in CrossFit, for example, and I can't do a heels on the ground body weight squat. And I just wanted to see if I could still do it, and it was this funny thing where it's like, like, of course you stop doing a movement, you lose it. I still think having a resting squat position where you can have the dorsiflexion, where you can keep your heels on the ground as a resting position, not as like a, you're going to keep your heels down and do a 400-pound squat, kind of letting go of that a little bit more, but thinking more in terms of like, there's still mobility in resting positions that you need to have. Like you should be able to rest on the ground comfortably in either a squat or a seiza position or a half seiza position where you have 1 foot up, and all these should feel loose and limber enough that you can stay resting in these postures. I think that's a good default for things that are just very basic.
Yeah, I think that to me the squat really is a resting posture. So that's how I kind of treat it. I rest in a squat, and I mean, you should be able to lift a basic amount of weight in a squat, obviously, right? So there is value in that, but as far as training it, I just don't do it anymore in terms of weightlifting because I don't see the applicability in most things that I'm doing. Okay, that's just personal. Like, I think maybe you could modify it to be a little bit better by pushing the weight forward, but I honestly just don't do it anymore. It's a resting position for me. That's about as far as I go with it.
And like when I'm talking about like I would use weight to train my resting squat position, for example. I would get myself in the right positions, and I would use that to create tissue length so that I could have the tissue length to have a good resting squat. Like right now, I don't have the dorsiflexion to have a flat-footed resting squat position with my feet pointed forward. I would need weighted assistance to put myself in that range and to develop the tissue length to eventually be able to own that position. So I think there is, even for fundamental stuff, right? That's not necessarily directly training elasticity, that's training tissue length. But I think there's beyond just motion, I think you need to have a certain level of range for resting postures, for the ability to rest on the ground, not just sit your ass on a chair.
Yeah, and like when you're starting this stuff out, you might not even be able to do seiza position, getting your butt to your heels. You might not be able to get into a squat, but doing it more and more is going to get you into those positions. Now, you can get something like a seiza chair, which is sitting your butt on a little bit of a stool as you're trying to get into a seiza position, butt to your heels, right? So it's a progression just like anything else. Your resting postures, if you can't get into them, you need to progress down into them. And they're ultra important. Resting postures are what tunes your body during the day. Okay, so if you're missing these, then you're missing tuning your body during the day, and you're going to try to get it all in right before your workout. It's just not going to work out as well. So if you can rest, if you have a job where you can be on the ground a little more, use a seiza chair, vary your positions. All these things are important to the health of your connective tissue. Okay, to actually have quality connective tissue. not just in training, but don't forget you're training this all day. The connective tissue within your body, muscles, fascia, that's being worked continuously, whether you sit or move. Okay. So you want to train it correctly, and you want to train it right, and you want to give it more opportunities to have varying positions. So, yeah, I can't stress the importance of resting positions, tuning positions enough. That's the squat. That's the size of position. That's one leg up, one down, like in a bar stool type of scenario, which, by the way, they put the bar stools up so people could stay longer and not have back pain. That's anecdotal, but I've heard that story before. So yeah, it's basically like that. You really need your resting positions, and we're designed to have them, and most people don't. So you're going to suffer the consequences at some point of either not having ranges of motion or just pain in general and stiffness.
Do you think, I think one of the things that I'm seeing where we might defer a little bit is I don't mind doing a lot more loaded mobility and a lot of extended range work to get into these positions where you're almost saying it's just frequency of doing these positions and gradually progressing into them.
Yeah, no, I definitely think you can use weights to get into these ranges of motion. I'm just saying ideally, like a human wouldn't be constantly loading himself to get into a resting squat, right? Basically what I'm saying is if you can do it more frequent, do that, okay? Instead of putting weights on for a short period of time. But if you need to, let's say you have to sit all day and you have no choice, by all means, do the weighted version. It will help, right? But we only have so much time in the day, most people, to devote to their bodies. Most people are putting an hour in a day into the aesthetic look of the muscles, right? In general. I'm saying that dedicating an hour a day or at least to the quality of your tissues is of utmost importance, okay? And that doesn't necessarily mean aesthetics. Tuning positions are super, super key to the quality of your tissue.
But let's talk a little bit of practicality, because we have one sort of thing. It's like sit more in these good resting postures so that your tissue quality improves. But let's talk about other ways to train this sort of nebulous idea of tissue quality. What are some practical steps for the people who, like you're doing this all day, you're still standing well, you're sitting and resting well? What are actual, because we're thinking, and most people are going to think in terms of like, well, give me a workout, give me something to do. What are some training methods that you would sort of apply to improve tissue quality?
Well, people are already doing it with stretching. Stretching is one way to do it. I just think it's a little bit overdone in terms of like static stretching. There's bounding. So, what's it called? Jump rope. It's as simple as that. Jump rope for 2 to 3 minutes twice a day. That'll take care of at least the basics. Okay. Now you can definitely take that further, but that would be the easiest way to implement some work where you're keeping the elasticity of your body going. Jump rope, 5 minutes a day, right? Anything bounding is going to work though. A light jog, something where you kind of have to bounce. Trampoline, people, I know those mini trampolines were popular for a bit. They use them in Pilates. Yeah, anything where you have to bound up and down using the elastic tension of your body.
Okay, so that's some lower body bounding. Is there any upper body stuff that you would? Because I think jump rope, you get a lot of calves. You get that lymph fluid moving because you're kind of doing that jumping. Running obviously is just running, like jogging has that bounding effect. You get that lymph moving again. What do you think for upper body tissue quality?
Yeah, so like you have to do an upper body bounding motion, which isn't very popular because it's boxing is a great one. Okay, there's boxing, there's skipping does it. Okay, rope flow. I couldn't recommend it more. That'll take a couple of years to catch on, but I really do think it's going to catch on. Okay, so roping, rope flow, what is it called? Club bells, mace bells, things along that line where you're moving weight instead of lifting it. Okay, so I'm controlling the weight going in a circular fashion. That is the key, right? So there's Indian clubs, mace bells, club bells, and you're swinging the weight in a circular way. Okay, I couldn't get more simple than that, but you actually have to learn the basics to be able to do it competently. But the good part about that is you can do thousands of reps over and over again without hurting yourself because it's such an easy thing to do. You're going in a circular fashion. So let's say you're swinging an Indian club over your head and you're going in a circular throwing motion, and you can just repeat over and over and over again. So not only are you getting your fascia to pull in the end ranges and getting the health from that, you're also getting the nervous system to recognize a throwing motion. So when I go to do that and throw with my left hand now, I've had thousands of reps to do it. Okay, so like there's a lot of benefits there, but you actually have to learn a little bit with those types of things. Or you can just run, right, and use your arms. I mean, that'll get it a little bit. I mean, there's levels to this, right? If you want to get the very, very basics, go for a jog. Make sure your hands are moving and get some skipping in here or there. If you want to take it to the next level, grab a rope, learn some rope flow. If you really want to take it to the next level, then you're going to have to get some Indian clubs or some mace bells and learn how to swing. Sledgehammers.
True.
Yeah, so that's what I'd recommend there.
That's cool. That's really cool. It's funny, I haven't used mace bells before, but I keep seeing videos of them pop up. The rope flow, obviously you taught me the basics of rope flow, that figure 8 pattern, and just a few other things that have really impacted my, it's funny because I struggled with shoulder positioning and shoulder posture for a long time. And just a couple of weeks of doing rope flow with that kind of conscious movement, specifically through the thoracic and through the upper body, my scapular positioning was significantly less winged just from doing that. And I found that really interesting because, scapular winging was something that I've kind of aggressively fought against for years. And then just after a few weeks of roping, my scapular was significantly less winged. That's super, super cool. Now, let's say a person, like this is all very, very basic stuff because this is all, it's energy expenditure. This is really great. You can do any of this stuff for weight loss. Because weight loss is just, you just move your body and consume less calories. That's like an obvious fitness goal. For athletic applications, if you're training this tissue quality, is it enough to just practice your sport after that? If you have like a movement practice where you're focusing more on this sort of tissue quality and this sort of elastic quality within your training, is it enough to just practice your sport after that, or should you throw in some sort of strength or work capacity training on top of that?
I think it really depends on the sport, and this is the $1 million question, right? This is where something like, this is what ATG kind of answers, right? Where they're like, what we need to do is make the tissues as strong as they possibly can, and the biomechanics will take care of itself, right? Or we're just not going into that realm. Let's make the tissues as long and strong as possible. I think that's the realm that it's going into with athletes now. It's let's make the tissues as strong as possible. And then you practice your sport, and then we can combine the two. Where I think like a GOTA or WEC method, maybe I'll just speak more for GOTA on this one. It's let's get into the right mathematical patterns of the joints of the body before we concentrate on the tissue quality, okay? Because we're going to stop the injuries from happening in the first place. We won't need all that energy into putting into tissues if we get the patterns correct first, which I actually agree with. But I think you can do both. Just depends how much time you want to put into it, right? Having a practice where you purposely make your tissue stronger. I'm not talking about muscles. I'm talking about more like ATG, where you go into super long ranges and work the long ranges of your muscles versus just the short ranges, or the, like a Joel Siegman 90 degrees is the safest thing, right? So yeah, I'm kind of torn on that one. I personally like GOTA's approach. of being in the math and working from there, being inside ankle bone high, back chain dominant, having all that before you start worrying about tissues. But I'm open to being debate on this one for sure. What do you think?
Yeah, and that well, you know, I'm kind of torn on it, right? Because I've been through so many different, you know, I've been through the phase of completely sedentary and overweight. I've been through the phase of, you know, even when I was a power lifter, I would still do things like jumps, and I would do, you know, more coordinated movement with kettlebell flow movements. And I didn't have a lot of rotation in my training. And I noticed that when I went into yoga years later, that my rotation was terrible from doing all this sagittal and frontal plane work. But, you know, one thing that I did notice was, like, as my squat went up, I could sprint like a motherfucker, right? Now, could I sprint even better if I hadn't if I had just prioritized those movement patterns? The thing is, I hadn't tested that, right? That's something that I'm kind of fascinated by. I do know that there is some virtue to being able to have power output in your muscular system. If you want to run faster and you can activate more muscle fibers, you know, that doesn't necessarily mean learn maximum irradiation of your core and brace your core as hard as you can in your glutes and squeeze your muscles as tight as you can. That doesn't necessarily mean that. But there is something to, you know, progressive resistance training and the, you know, the ability to produce force. There is something to it, right? And I don't want to discard it completely just for, you know, max. Like, the thing is, it is a matter of priority, right? I think there's what I've always been a fan of is minimal effective dose training. You know, I've kind of mentioned for hypertrophy, for example, the Mike Menser every, you know, 3 to 7 days training. I actually did a podcast, my very first podcast I ever did on No Filter. I interviewed the Mindful Mover, who used to be, you know, a sort of Ido Portal movement culture enthusiast, where he was training for 5 hours a day, and then he injured himself and was just over the top. And then his whole method now is based around 5 movements that he does once every 7 to 10 days, basically, to failure and beyond. And that's all he will do. And he doesn't do any fitness other than that. He'll go for walks. He'll do other stuff. But, you know, he thinks that, like, that amount of fitness isn't good for your body. Basically, it's like use the minimal effective dose. So I think it's not that you should throw away the, you know, strength and conditioning altogether, because especially the conditioning thing, I think is really interesting, because having the, you know, a good work capacity is super useful, not just for athletics, but for life in general. You know, having good oxygenation of your blood, having good blood flow, and just generally having good efficiency of energy within your body's internal systems, which is brought on by, like, metabolic conditioning work. I think that is important. You know, I don't want to just throw that away just to practice, you know, pure patterning. But I do think that in terms of an actual repetition and time investment thing, I would probably say top is movement quality. In the middle would be work capacity, and at the very bottom you could have, and this is, I'm talking in terms of time investment, would be just pure power output or strength output. I do love tissue conditioning, but, you know, one of the things, like, I've done the ATG system, I've done range of strength. The ATG system is great because his zero program, the body weight only program, was like 3 20-minute sessions a week, and that was it. You know, like, it was like an hour a week, versus if you're spending, you know, multiple hours, you know, like 5 to 6 times that amount of time, you're spending 5 or 6 hours doing your sport or practicing the patterns, or having a movement practice outside of just the tissue conditioning, that I think you can get away with that. But it's how much time, like you said, it's how much time do you want to spend on these particular aspects, and how much of your life do you want to live? One of the things I loved about the Mindful Mover was that he was like, you know, I do a 45-minute workout every 7 days, and then I live my fucking life. I read books. I spend time with my wife. I learn things. I'm living a life outside of thinking about my body and how much I can squeeze out of it. I'm still getting better results than I was getting when I was training 5 hours a day.
Yeah, like, I don't ever go to a gym anymore, personally, so I'm kind of like an outlier, right? But I'm also probably in the best shape of my life in terms of athleticism, injury free, all that stuff, right? Like I do have past injuries that were stacked up, but I don't feel any inflammation in my body anymore. I can move really well. I feel free inside my body. So something happened here. I did something correct. Okay. It was like, and I used to lift a lot of weight. I used to be quote unquote, I would say really strong, and I wasn't getting anything in terms of the fruit. I was always sore. I was always tired. Okay. So I was constantly just regenerating for the next workout. Now, there's a happy medium for most people, right? And it is really about time allocation. So for me, getting into the right patterns and having your body, making sure your body is equipped for basic life. Okay, depends who you are, but equipped for basic life is key, so you don't injure yourself always. Okay, a lot of people just keep stacking injuries and keep going to the gym and doing their same routines and stacking more injuries. It's just like that has to end at some point. So I do recommend getting into like a functional patterns, GOTA, WEC method, or something along those lines where biomechanics and how you move, the quality of movement is at least prioritized for a significant amount of time. Let's say 6 months. Try to dive into something where biomechanics is prioritized. Even FRC, functional range conditioning, does this. Yeah, I'd say that's my practical advice there, because everyone's coming from a different spot. So it's really hard to pin down what you should do. Again, for me, it's all I shouldn't say all pattern training. It's a lot of GOTA training mixed in with martial arts. So every day I'll pick a couple martial arts moves from professional videos that I've watched, like professional fighters, and I practice those as like my skill for the day. Then I mix that in with during my day where I'm at the office, I'll be in bow and corner as I work. So my work has now become an opportunity to pattern train. Right now I'm in sizer position. I'm sitting on my heels. I'm constantly doing something, but it's not interfering with my day. I'm trying to put it within my day. Okay, so this is a workout. This at the end of the day is going to make me more athletic. I'm going to have more capacity with my body. Keep doing it this way a month from now versus just pounding it at the gym and constantly having my body in recovery mode.
Right. So it's kind of gradual tissue adaptation as opposed to like brunt force tissue damage that you have to allocate a ton of recovery resources to.
Yeah, I'm constantly trying to make my tissues more, how do I say this, like efficient. Just able to understand where my body is in space, use the elasticity of my connective tissue to do work for me instead of having to rely on muscles. And the good part about that is when you train it, one, you get the benefit of having your muscles be not your muscles, your body having connective tissue that's elastic. So it just keeps being elastic more and more and more, okay? And you're training the patterns that are going to keep you that way for life, right? So now I run down the street, I'm more worried about how I'm reacting to the ground, how my body is passing its energy from side to side in an elastic way versus how fast I'm going or anything along those lines, right? So as I build that up, I'm getting faster anyway, and I'm getting the conditioning anyway. So that's just an insight on how I do it within my own life.
This is really interesting because we're talking a lot about tissue efficiency, right? And I remember when I was powerlifting, the squat was something that really fascinated me, because how I would squat was I'd load up the bar as heavy as I could basically support on my back. I would create as much core tension as possible. And then I would drop into the squat and use the stretch reflex to almost bounce myself up. And I would lift a fucking ton of weight. You know, I like at my peak powerlifting days, I think I did 315 for 21 reps. You know, and it was a hard set, but like I did it, and I was just like, you know, I would bounce, and as soon as I hit that elastic recoil, I would contract, and I just had so much power out of there. And I remember thinking, it's like, this is amazing. I'm training my elastic recoil almost more or as much as my muscles right now. And I remember Christian Thibodeau, he was like sort of my role model strength coach, said, yeah, you can lift more weight, and you should have training blocks where you're doing that, where you're using that stretch reflex, but that's very short-sighted. You need to also do slow eccentric moves so that you can train tendonal thickness so that your tendons can withstand that sort of elasticity. Do you think tendonal thickness or training tendonal thickness, because I think that is ultimately what like ATG, he's over toes guy, when he's doing those extreme ranges and he's loading his joint, he's training tendonal thickness. That's what, we'll talk to Keegan Smith about that, but he's a great video on YouTube where I think it's ATG tendon training secrets or something, where he's talking about a lot of the training is tendonal thickness training. Do you think that tendonal thickness alone could help improve that elasticity, or would you have to train that elastic quality as well as the thickness?
I think you have to train the quality and the thickness. Like, it's not going to become elastic unless you give it properties of elasticity. Like the people who can lift the most weight, Olympic lifters, power lifters, they're not the most boundy people. You're not going to see them jumping too often. And if you do, it's going to look very awkward. Okay? Like, you at some point have to put it into more of a bounce. The question is, how much can I actually strengthen it and then make it into a elastic property? Do you know what I mean by that? Like, it's really interesting. The example that you mentioned before with the squatting, going down to the bottom end range and then bouncing, I used to do that as well, right? And I'd feel the tension in my quads all the way up to my hip flexors. And at the bottom, I would use that tension to bounce out and lift a significant amount of weight like that, right? So I am using my tendon strength, or I should say my fascial strength, where it's tightest to assist me in the motion that I want to do. Now, that's too slow and controlled for real life motion, and it's not how you would move in a real life motion. If I'm squatting and I'm just going down with two legs and catching that tight portion at the bottom with both feet on the ground versus moving one foot way in front of the other and the other back. So like when I'm running, I'm going back and forth with my tissues. They're going to be pulling at a different point than they would if they were under load in a squat. So I'm not even training to be better in other motions other than the squat. Maybe some motions that have resemblance to the squat, but for a run, for locomotion, I don't even think they correlate that much. The stretches are going to come in different planes and different times during a run versus a squat. So you have to really train specifically when it comes to the elasticity component. And this is where my philosophy kind of runs in with ATG. I don't see them actually training elasticity in the ranges of motion that they're going to use during the athletic motion. So take the ATG split squat, for instance. You're in an extreme range of motion that you won't ever see in a sport. Okay? Now, their thought process there is that if you cover this, you can cover everything, right? Because we've hit all ranges of motion because we've hit this extreme range of motion. But the motions in between, the actual very specific angles that you have to hit during a real life motion may not correlate with your extreme range of motion. That's my thought process. You really have to train the exact angle that you need to train. Okay, so like let's say I'm a high jumper. Okay, this is just an example. And to jump over the bar, my ankle needs 25 degrees of range of motion, and that's usually where I take off from. I would like to see some bounding at 25 degrees range of motion, similar to what you would take off during your jump. Do you get what I'm saying? Not just 100 degrees of range of motion. Mm-hmm. That won't cover the 25 degrees. It has to be very, 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 very specific. Now, again, the question really is, if I go into extreme ranges of motion with what I'm doing, how much of that is covering the less extreme ranges of motion? In terms of elastic recoil.
The interesting thing that I'm seeing in people who practice like the ATG system, for example, is a lot of their verts increase, a lot of their jumping capacity increases. My own anecdotal experiences, I felt a lot springier when I did those programs. I did the zero program and the dense strength program and added in, a few extras myself. And I felt really stringy. My vert increased, and that's anecdotal, right? And the one thing that I observed about, everyone who looks at Ben Patrick, like knees over toes guy, for example, he can dunk and he's got this vert and he can do all this crazy stuff and he can do all these motions. But, like the motions that he's doing is playing his sport, right? So if he's doing a lot of, he's still technically training these positions. And this is, we had a short conversation with Keegan Smith, and he mentioned, you will get these guys in who do nothing but do their sport, and they'll come in and they'll be able to do Nordic curls without ever training, and they can do all this stuff, but then they're injury prone. They end up injuring themselves. So what we do is we take these guys that are already trained and we kind of injury proof them by conditioning their tissues to sort of deal with, these patterns and stuff that they're putting themselves in anyway. Now, I think the difference in philosophy from what we've sort of talked about in all of our previous episodes compared to that is that we would also prioritize, okay, well, that's fine and good, but we also have to prioritize patterning in the right secure positions so that you're not going in the positions where you would injure yourself in the first place, right? So that inside ankle bone high position, learning how to get over your columns, learning how to set bows and corners properly. You would still want to pattern all that stuff in, even if you are tissue training. Like, again, this is like the whole, you can do both, right? I think, but it's like, but you want to almost prioritize the most repetitions. You want to prioritize being pattern setting. You still want to play your sport. I think doing movement and motion in general, this is something that, I struggle with because I don't play any sports right now. It's, winter in Canada, and I don't feel like, I'm not a hockey player, and I don't really like playing hockey on the ice. I don't know if there's any indoor soccer leagues, and it's harder to find intramural sports with COVID lately, frankly. But if there was a sport that I could play, I'd play a sport. I'm going to try and learn dancing, and I'm doing a bunch of other stuff. But for me, movement basically meant the hour that I spent in the gym for the longest time, not the sport. Not any sport that I was playing. Maybe when I was in high school, I played a lot of soccer and rugby and stuff. But I think the way that you develop a healthy body is by doing stuff with it. And I don't mean just for an hour a day. It's actually, like playing and that running and cutting and that sort of athletic bounding that we're meant to do as human beings. People call CrossFit a sport. In a sense it is, you're testing, it's a test of sorts. And it is competitive, but it doesn't have that sort of like game element to it, that playful element to it that sort of like other team sports might have. And so it's, the difference in philosophy kind of being, you should do lots of physical stuff with your body, but it shouldn't, the gym should almost be a supplement to the physical stuff that you're doing, not the main physical thing that you're committing yourself to. I think that's the change in philosophy that I've sort of seen over the last year.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And we're talking about changing people's habits, right? So, I mean, that's not going to happen too quickly. I think the people listening to us are probably already on the same type of train, right? They're thinking more deeply about movement than they are about, aesthetics, bodybuilding, power training, anything like that, right? Or powerlifting. So let's go back to what you were saying earlier about like ATG and what they're doing. I really like what they're doing. Don't get me wrong. But what I think is it's really hard to see what variables are doing what. Do you know what I mean? Like a lot of their coaches are already elite. Like a lot of those guys already move really well. Doing slow controlled lifting is definitely going to stop you from getting a lot of injuries in the gym, which I personally suspect a lot of athletes are getting hurt in the gym or predisposing themselves from what they're doing in the gym to get hurt on the field. Okay, so I think even toning down the training and the way that athletes go about it in the gym will stop a lot of injuries in itself, right? So it's really hard to see what variables are actually doing what. in either case, I really like the way ATG approaches progressions, okay, how they progress things. If I could sell progression as well as ATG in terms of like getting a patient in the office as a chiropractor to, load their patellar tendon progressively over a period of weeks, ATG made something like that sexy. You know what I mean? Made something like that something to strive for athletes. That was never a thing. You know what I mean? Getting someone to slowly, progressively load a patellar tendon, and like a skateboard. It's really hard to get someone to actually do in a series for weeks, right? But it works. It works really well. So props to ATG for making, slow progression sexy, right? So that's awesome. Good stuff. But I suspect that there's a lot of variables that we're not looking at as well. An with something like GOTA, you can say the same thing, right? Like you can look at what they say sometimes on Instagram. Let's say they look at an injury. They're like, oh, that guy wasn't back chain dominant, or that guy went inside ankle bone low and he's injured there. Look at his Achilles blew out, right? Maybe there's more variables there that we're not seeing, but the difference is that GOTA's looking at the actual slow motion and saying, look at what's happening in this frame by frame injury, where ATG is just like, guys, this works because I've seen it work. But I can't isolate the variables and tell you which one is actually working. But my program works, so just do the damn program, right? So, and I'm not saying it's not legit, but there's no variables there for me to touch other than we're going long and strong, guys. Have the strongest, longest muscles you can, and things will work out really well. For me, that's not specific enough. However, if it's working for you, by all means, do it, and that's great.
One of the things that I learned about human nature is that people don't really care about the why or the how. They just care if it works, right? And that for me, that's not the case. I'm always obsessed with the whys. And one of the reasons I joined ATG for coaches originally was like, all right, tell me why, tell me exactly how is this working, right? And I didn't find a lot of information on on the explanation. It was more, it's like, all right, train your tibialis because that's the first thing that hits the ground and it'll absorb force. I'm like, yeah, but how? Like, tell me more. Like, tell me more about this. Give me the mechanics of it. And I didn't find a lot of the mechanics, and that was one of the things that I was like, am I gonna just have to get over this? Am I gonna have to get over the fact that they're not explaining like the variables of how and why this works and just see if it works kind of thing? Because I've done that before. I've let go of that before. I'm like, all right, people are, the carnivore diet was a good example for me where I looked at it. I was like, this is ridiculous. But I saw all the anecdotal results that people were getting. And I was like, well, okay, maybe there's something to it, right? Now they have a Harvard study about the carnivore diet and they're starting to explore the mechanisms of how it works and everything. And it's one of these things that, and disclaimer, I don't follow a carnivore diet at all, but I think it's very fascinating and I've dabbled with it and I'll continue to dabble with it in the future, but it's one of these things, like for me personally, I'm the same as you. It's like, okay, well, look at the motions, discover the variables and create a solution from it based on that. Don't just, now you're, instead of saying, hey, this works, do it. I'm sure there's plenty of explanations for, and Ben Patrick does have a gazillion explanations for why his stuff works, why gradual tissue loading works. It's just not from a biomechanical lens. It's from a tissue lens, right? I think that's the big difference is when we're talking, we usually talk about tissues, but we talk about tissues from the biomechanical lens, right? So it's like, how are your tissues affecting your biomechanics versus how are your tissues affecting your tissues and how are your tissues affecting how you feel in your bodies? That's the mainstream lens that most people look through, I think.
Yeah. Again, it's really hard to isolate the variables, right? And that's why I think the GOTA's approach of reverse engineering it. Let's see what we're actually seeing in these good movers and these people who are durable and these elderly people, the indigenous that haven't been touched by Western culture, kids that move really well. What are they doing similarly? And then let's reverse engineer the exercises from those motions. I think that's isolating the variable is actually much better. Okay, you can argue over if they're correct or not, but I think that's a better way to approach it. However, I can't just throw out the value of what ATG is doing, right? They're obviously, they're onto something with the progressive overload of tissues. And even, let's say, I don't personally subscribe to their approach. Well, most people are coming from a lifting background anyway, so it doesn't matter what I think. It's where most people are at. You know what I mean? They need to be, like, especially athletes, come from a lifting culture. If they need to switch that, if they need to bring it into another realm of lifting that's more appropriate to, injury and being healthier for longer, then so be it, right? Even if it's not what I would think is the most optimal. So again, I think ATG selling progressive overload is great. Again, the criticism is not being able to isolate the variables. And even I'm the same way, right? I wanted to really know when he's like, going backwards on the sled is really going to bulletproof you. I'm like, okay, sweet. What does that mean though? And then I'll go to the next video and he'll be like, it's bulletproof. I'm bulletproof. I can go backwards. And then it's just like more sled is going to make you more bulletproof. But I haven't seen many explanations of why backwards running actually makes you more resilient than forwards, other than the knees going over toes. I get it. The knees go over toes, right? But why is that the case? Why physiologically and why mechanically is going backwards improving your forwards? Why is that the case? Like, I don't know. That's a question that I want to answer, like, in terms of the mechanics behind it, right? Maybe I'm not going to get the answer. I don't know.
You won't get a biomechanical answer, but you will get a tissue tolerance answer. You will get the, like you said, it's knees over the toes. I get it. That's literally it. For most people who can't extend their knees over their toes or they have knee pain, walking backwards is a very basic way to get blood flow to that area and to start conditioning that tissue. Because the whole idea is it's the SAID principle, specific adaptations to impose demands. And if you're demanding that your knees get loaded over and over and over again, then eventually they'll be able to withstand force. And then if you had knee pain running forward and you've been doing a bunch of backwards running for, to train basically this joint, then that joint won't hurt anymore when you're moving forward. And that's the idea of being bulletproof. It's like you're just specifically conditioning that joint. And that's the idea of being bulletproof. Right now,
I'll push back on that.
To stop. Sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, so you said specific adaptations to impose demand on the first thing. Specifically adapting to backwards is what you're going to do if you're going to go backwards, right? So I understand the blood flow argument, and I agree with that. I would do it differently than that. However, it is an easy way to get blood flow within the tissues, but at some point you are neurologically priming yourself to move backwards versus forwards, specifically adapting the tissues to backwards motion, and as well as the neurologically you're doing it and mechanically. Okay, so the SAID principle would work the same backwards as forwards. So that's my pushback on that. And why have the bleeding in the first place? Why not acknowledge that there's a bow structure? Like, I don't understand systems not acknowledging GOATA's bow structure. Like, they found something so brilliant, but yet no one else is acknowledging it. So simple, yet so brilliant. The bow, okay? The landing position, I haven't actually heard anyone try to disprove it, because I think you're going to look pretty bad trying to disprove it. But I also haven't heard many people actually acknowledging it either, right? So, like, why not acknowledge the bow as something legitimate, acknowledge spinal engine as something legitimate, and train with those in mind so we don't get injured in the first place, so we don't have to do all this tissue training in terms of, like, backwards motion, getting blood in. But hey, I'm not saying there's no applicability to it. I'm just saying that I'm not finding good enough explanations to train it as a priority over something like training the bow. Yeah.
So, and that was my follow-up point too, right? Where it's like you can make the argument that you're bulletproofing the knees. And I agree with you that you're coding your tissues to be optimized for moving backwards, right? Like, I think the other thing about the backwards moving is that it's a regression from some of the other knee loading movements that they do, right? So for people who really can't load their knees with even like their step ups or the long lunges or anything, it's backwards walking is something that's very, very gentle that still loads the knee, and the whole point is progressive loading of the patellar tendon, like we talked about, right? But it's this, again, you're emphasizing becoming bulletproof versus emphasizing, trying to not fire bullets at yourself anymore. That's basically, stop being shot at is a good way to become bulletproof.
What I've noticed, this is just anecdotal from what I've seen, but and I watch quite a bit in terms of the guys who do functional patterns, even ATG, FRC. Nobody's really acknowledging that there is and the PRI, Personal Restoration Institute. Nobody's acknowledging GOTA's steps, or that there could be a proper way to walk and run, and that there is basically that GOTA is legitimate, right? Like everyone's like, yeah, I like GOTA, I like parts of it, but I rarely see anyone go into what they like about GOTA. Specifically tell me what you like about it. It never goes to there. It goes to, yeah, they got some good ideas. You'll see this all the time, actually. So they got some good ideas, but yeah, most of what they're saying is no good. You know what I mean? So, but then again, I'll see people using their exercises and not acknowledging that it's their exercise without knowing that that's happening. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think I've sent you an example of somebody doing the drop-in, but not acknowledging that it was the GOTA maneuver, and not acknowledging that in order to do the drop-in, you have to do the bow, and you haven't even acknowledged that the bow's a thing yet. Do you know what I mean? So it's like,
and this was from the same account that like weeks prior had a public video that was criticizing the GOTA movement system as a whole, right? Like I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, no, yeah, that was definitely a thing, right? So basically what I'm saying is a lot of people are adopting what GOTA's doing without realizing that, without legitimizing what they're doing, okay? So I think GOTA's getting a lot of criticism that's harsh at this point, considering that they have obviously brilliant portions of their system that people are adopting. Physios, chiros, people are seeing it and not acknowledging it. And I don't think that's right in terms of where we need to go with this stuff. We need to parse out what is good and what's not good, and what should be prioritized and what shouldn't. And that's kind of where we're coming in here. We're trying to see, with all this gold, ATG, FRC, functional patterns, WEC method, GOTA, a few others that I'm forgetting right now, what is the actual gold there? And what is the proper way to sequence to move forward? To me, I think GOTA has the very prerequisite fundamental starting point for motion. And then from there, we can argue over what to build. But I think that they have the proper sequence to start, and that is to not bleed in the first place, to not get injured in the first place, because they have the proper mathematical joint angles, let's say, that will keep you resilient.
Yeah, and again, like that's the whole point of the art of move, is to kind of investigate those gold nuggets and that sequencing, right? Like once you have the principle, it kind of like we sort of used GOTA as a preliminary map, or at least what they've observed as a preliminary map. Now it's kind of filling in the spaces, right? Because even with the GOTA certification, I think, and even though GOTA has been around for quite a long time, there's still, in terms of how you actually train these patterns, there's so much room for growth. It's still very, very young. Using the map and in terms of how to optimize for that, I think there's so much that, even old school strength and conditioning and old school reps and set schemes and old school ideas about, training in general has a lot to teach within the frame of the new map, and within the frame of these fundamental movement patterns and these principles, right? Because training it is a totally different thing than understanding it, and observing it, and learning how to code it, and learning how to understand it. I mean, even just I've been doing a lot of the movement patterns and a lot of the coding work that GOTA programmed in, and ran into some hiccups, right? So I've had to explore and I've had to innovate myself in terms of how it works for my own body, because I'm not working directly with a coach. And even if I was working with a coach, they would have to innovate within my own structure to sort of troubleshoot around that. It's still young, right? So a lot of the practical stuff, that's what I'd kind of like to start diving more into in future episodes. I mean, we're episode 18 of The Art of Move right now, and we've covered so much ground. If I look at the diversity of topics that we've talked about, right from our episode 1 of the fundamentals of function to the spinal engine, mapping out shoulder movement, our multiple episodes on just foot mechanics. We've covered a lot of ground in terms of how and why we think the body should move in a particular way. Now from here, I'd like to start exploring more, practicality. When we talk about a movement practice, there's a practical element to that, right? So that's, I want to keep it there for episode 18. We're going to do episode 19 very, very shortly, maybe a follow-up episode of this. We had some videos that we queued up, but sure enough, we're already, 75 minutes into this episode with, and it feels like we've been talking for 15 minutes. So I find these episodes do always fly by. Any closing thoughts, any standout points that if someone was going to walk away with something from this episode, what would you want them to walk away with?
That you should start thinking about training your tissues a little bit differently. Not so much muscular force, but be more efficient with how you use the elasticity of your body. Okay, and we'll dive into how to do that. Again, rope flow is a good way to do it. A very basic way to do it is jump rope, just making sure you get some 5 minutes of bounding, jumping in during a day. That will keep you at least at a minimum, okay? Minimum baseline there. But there's many other avenues you can go into. Club bells, mace bells, Indian clubs, rope flow, martial arts, dance. Things that are systems that are going to keep you elastic in order to age well. If you don't use it, you lose it. And that includes elasticity, and good luck getting that back. That is not one you want to lose. Okay, so we need to stop compression so much and start bounding.
Yeah, and just to re-emphasize that point, there is a specific, I guess like a tissue called elastin that is that's in your tissues that definitely goes down as you age. There's no way to replace elastin. It changes, your tissues literally change over time. So if you're already decreasing your elastin levels by decreasing the elasticity of your tissues now, then as you age, it's going to get worse and worse, and you're not going to be able to reverse it. So reverse it while you're younger. Reverse it while you're in your your teens, your 20s, your 30s. If you're in your 40s, start now. Don't think it's too late to do it, but just start training that elasticity. Start moving in actual motions. Maybe next episode we'll dive a little bit deeper into some more specific structures for movement practice, some different ideas for movement practice and how you can set it up. For those of you who are kind of obsessed as I am with periodization or workout structures or programming that follows some sort of reliable progression, we can kind of dive a little bit into that. But for those of you who have been listening to this podcast so far, thank you so much. We record these live on nofilter.net. You can always see our upcoming episodes if you go to nofilter.net. My name is Anthony Manuel. If you look up me on the platform, you'll be able to find my profile. December 21st, we're going to talk to Keegan Smith of the ATG system, which we referenced many times during this episode. I'm really, really excited for that. Get your tickets while you can. And just remember, No Filter is a live interactive platform, so you can always ask questions in the chat. You can hit the knock button. You can actually join the stream directly and have a little conversation or debate if there's anything that you're curious about. And thank you guys for listening. We're really stoked to see the viewership growing episode to episode on this, and we're really excited to continue to offer more value as this podcast evolves. We're going to be putting out our own programs and stuff eventually soon too. And yeah, thanks for everyone who's been listening. We'll catch you on episode 19. This was episode 18 of The Art of Move.
Have a good one, guys.